Good morning, and welcome to Seattle Atheist Church. Welcome, atheists, agnostics, skeptics, whatever you like to call yourself, you are welcome here. At Seattle Atheist Church, we call ourselves an atheist church because you will never hear anything supernatural promoted from the podium. Our church is founded on the principles of scientific naturalism and secular ethics. Truth claims are attempted here, and we stand ready to revise our thinking in light of new information. We attempt to be excellent to all conscious beings, and we believe in good, because good works in non-mysterious ways. If that sounds right to you, you are probably in the right place. So thanks to everyone who came out yesterday for our Saturday Secular Social. It happens the third Saturday of every month at Browers at 3 o'clock, and everyone is invited. That's it for the announcements for today. Please consider making a donation either at the website, seattleatheist.church, or in the donation jar in the back of the room. We use the donations just to rent the room. We also have a goal of being at possibly some of the street fairs coming up, and so that's what we'd like to use the donations for. So we'll have a short talk, and then afterwards we'll get into a circle and have some discussion, and real church, it sort of happens like that. So please come on up.
You are not the best judge of what will make you happy. And that has profound consequences for how you'll navigate your life. So this is really a talk about why you shouldn't trust yourself. That's really the goal of the talk. I am going to discuss Kahneman and also Tversky's work around, from their book, Thinking Fast and Slow. I'm going to focus on the third part of that book. And most of the work there is focused on causing us to question whether we're the best judge of happiness, not only for ourselves, but for others. And so that has profound consequences, not only for how we should lead our own lives. Hopefully at the end of this talk, you'll be much more cautious about how you make judgments about what to do in the future, but also has profound consequences for public policy. For if you can't really trust people to pursue happiness individually, then it changes the way that you think that government should intervene in people's lives. So those are the two sort of conclusions that we're going to talk about. So back to Kahneman. So I'm going to talk about Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow. And in that book, he makes a distinction between two selves. Two selves. He distinguishes between something he calls the experiencing self and the remembering self. So these are two selves that are, involved in the world. And let me, these are a little bit at a metaphorical level, because he's not making any claims about, sort of how psychologically these things are implemented. But these selves come out of the research and the experiments that he's done. He thinks it's helpful to think of yourself in these two different ways when you're trying to understand the results of these different studies that we'll be talking about in a moment. So let's talk a little bit about what he means by the experiencing self. The experiencing self is you, moment to moment, feeling pleasure and pain. It's the actual experience that you go through when you enjoy a bowl of ice cream, or you feel intense pain when you stub your toe on a chair. It's the thing that experiences the world moment by moment. It might help. He talks about an economist called Edgeworth, who came up with this idea of a hedonometer. And the idea of a hedonometer is this device that works sort of like a thermometer, except what it does is it measures your level of happiness or unhappiness at every moment during the day. So, this thing doesn't actually exist, but you can imagine theoretically walking around with your hedonometer all the time and say, oh, yes, I'm this level of happy right now. This is what my hedonometer says. Or maybe I'll be on your iPhone someday. You can look down and say, I'm actually at 0.3 hedonometer level right now. But the idea here is, at each moment, you do have a certain level of happiness. And I don't want to, he's careful not to say that this level of happiness is just pain or pleasure. It's not as simple as that. It can be, a complex set of emotions. He writes, the experience of a moment or an episode is not easily represented by a single happiness value. There are many variants of positive feelings, including love, joy, engagement, hope, amusement, and many others. Negative emotions also come in many varieties, including anger, shame, depression, and loneliness. Although positive and negative emotions exist at the same time, it's possible to classify most moments of life as ultimately positive or negative. So his point here isn't to deny the complexity of human emotions and what's involved in moment-to-moment human happiness. There's anger and shame and guilt and love and all that goes into your moment-to-moment experience of life. But what he's saying is, in general, it should be possible to say, thumbs up or thumbs down to every moment, and at least have some sort of scale of saying this is a more positive or more negative moment. So if you recorded a person's entire life using this hedonometer, then you would be able to completely capture the entire amount of experiencing self-happiness. That's what it is. It's this moment-to-moment collection of experiences of the world. All right, so that's the experiencing self. The other self is the remembering self. And the remembering self is the person who reflects back on these experiences and makes a judgment about them. So it's the part of you, retrospectively, who decides whether or not a certain experience, like a vacation or a marriage or working at a job or any of these things, is a positive or a negative experience. And we use, it's really this remembering self that's in control. At the end of the day, it's the remembering self that decides, after evaluating previous experiences, it's the person who decides what you should do next. If it decides that vacation to Hawaii was great, it's going to make the decision to, maybe go to Fiji next time and not go to, Spokane or something. So it will make the decisions about your future actions. Okay, so if we could perfectly remember our moment-to-moment past experiences, then there would be no distinction between these two selves, right? If the remembering self was able to perfectly represent and replay all your previous memories, then there should be, no difference in judgment between your experiencing self and the remembering self. Unfortunately, however, Kahneman has done a number of experiments that demonstrate that the remembering self is out of whack with the amount of pleasure and pain that your experiencing self goes through when it's remembering past experiences. So in other words, our remembering self is open to cognitive illusions. And that makes us poor judges of what actually made us happy in the past, and makes us poor deciders on what we should do in the future. So his most famous experiment, and this is super compelling, he has a number of experiments in the book. I'm not going to go through all of them. I'm just going to talk about sort of the ones that I found most compelling. But his most compelling one was his colonoscopy experiment. How many people have heard of this experiment before? Yeah, a lot of you have. So I'll go through it because not all of you have heard of it. But when you reach the age of like 45, you have to go through this horrible procedure called a colonoscopy once every, depending on your history, once every 3 to 5 years. It's really awful. They stick a tube up your butt. They see if there's any polyps. It's no fun. It's super painful. And the way they used to do it, they would give you no painkillers at all. They'd put you on the bed, they jam this thing up your butt, and you just have to go through the whole painful experience. So what they wanted to do is he worked together with a doctor working in Toronto, and they decided they were going to do this experiment where they would ask patients, let's see, how many patients were they working with? They were working with 154 patients, and they would ask each patient while they're lying there on the table, once a minute, every 60 seconds, what's your level of pain between 0 and 10, where 0 is zero pain at all, and 10 is like intolerable amount of pain, and they would just record that while the person was going through their colonoscopy. And the colonoscopies that were performed went anywhere between 4 minutes and 69 minutes. So some people got in and out in 4 minutes. Other people, it's more than an hour. So a lot of variation between the lengths. Now, consider 2 patients. This is actual data from two patients who underwent the colonoscopy and where they recorded their experiences, patient A and patient B. And patient A had a colonoscopy that lasted for 8 minutes. So on the table for 8 minutes. And that patient had 2 peaks of pain. 3 minutes in, they reported an 8 on the pain scale. So that's pretty painful, right? 3 minutes in. And then at the end, the very end, at 8 minutes in, they reported a 7 on the pain scale. So it has, dips and it goes up and down if you look at the graph. But at the end it was around 7 on the pain scale. Now consider patient B. Patient B had a colonoscopy that lasted 24 minutes, so 3 times as long as patient A. That patient was on the table 3 times longer. 8 minutes in, that patient reported an 8 on the pain scale, so that's the same level as patient A. But then 24 minutes in, it was down to just a 1 on the pain scale. Now here's my question for you. Would you prefer, given a choice, to be patient A or patient B? And just as a reminder, patient A is 8 minutes, patient B is 24 minutes. So how many people want to be patient A? Okay, I'm really curious about this one. Not to, anyway, patient B. How many people want to be patient B? Oh, you're just weird. I don't believe you.
Don't judge.
I'm judging. This is weird. All right, so just to emphasize again, remember that patient B had a colonoscopy that was 3 times longer than patient A. So you're on that table 3 times as long. And also realize that if you're going to measure the total area under the curve, if you're going to look at that graph and see all the, amount of pain and collect them together, patient A has much less pain as measured by the moment-to-moment, amount of pleasure or pain going through it. But you guys, you still want to vote for patient B? All right, I'm going to be curious to figure. Yes.
Where was patient B at the 8-minute mark?
Where was what?
Where was patient B at the 8-minute mark? Like
at
how
the
quickly
8-minute
did
mark?
it drop off?
So both of them, the graph, I'm doing this from memory, but they went up and down. So they were both, it wasn't like one steady kind of curve. It was, up and down and up and down and up and down. But overall, patient A experienced less pain than patient B. But if you did the math on it. All right. So here's the surprising result. The patients were asked to rate, all the patients, all 154, were asked to rate the total amount of pain that they experienced during the procedure. And it turns out that patient A rated their pain much higher than patient B. So patient A claimed that they had a much worse experience than patient B, even though we know objectively, I'm going to say objectively, that they actually endured through their experiencing self much less pain. And the reason for this, and this is a theme that comes out of Kahneman's and Tversky's experiments in a lot of different contexts, is there's 2 principles that they have here. The 2 principles are, number one, something called the peak-end rule. And according to the peak-end rule, the global retrospective rating is well predicted by the average of the level of pain reported at the worst moment of the experience and at its end. Or the more general way of stating that is the way that you judge a past experience is by the peak level of pleasure or pain and then the last moment of pleasure and pain. You average those 2 values together, and that's your overall representation of your happiness or unhappiness undergoing the experience. The second principle is called duration neglect. And the idea of duration neglect is the duration of the procedure has no effect whatsoever on the ratings of total pain. So if you're lying there on the table for 8 minutes versus 24 minutes, as long as you can't tell the difference. As long as the peaks are the same and the endpoint is the same, if you double the amount of time, it makes no difference in how you judge the experience later on. It's invisible to you, the amount of time that you spent doing something. So what does that mean? What it means is that when we judge previous experience, we don't accurately judge the entirety of the experience. Our brain stores summary statistics. It's as if our brain stores only a single number to sum up a previous experience, the average of our peak level of pleasure or pain, and the level of pleasure or pain at the last moment of our experience. On the one hand, this conclusion should not be that surprising, If you've ever studied statistics, then you're familiar with the idea of descriptive statistics, right? Where you'll take a whole series of numbers and describe them with, a mean and, the variance and a mean, with two numbers to describe a huge set of numbers, because it's more efficient and more descriptive to be able to store it that way. So it's not that surprising that our brain does something similar. Instead of actually storing every moment of an experience like colonoscopy, it stores summary statistics, or the equivalent of summary statistics, to be able to judge that experience in the future. So on the one hand, it's not surprising, because if you designed a computer to work with the brain, you'd probably do something similar. But on the other hand, it's really surprising and bizarre, because it has all sorts of strange consequences for our lives. For example, consider the three versions of the same life that I'm going to describe right now. So these are three biographies, slightly different, and I'm going to ask you to judge which life you'd like to have. These are three different biographies. And this is another experiment that Kahneman did with Ed Diner. So the first biography, all three involve a woman named Jen. And Jen biography 1, Jen lived an extremely happy life. She never had children, but she lived a life that most people would find fulfilling. She spent time with friends and enjoyed many vacations and hobbies. She died a painless death in a car accident at the age of 30. So that's Jen biography number 1. Really fulfilling life. She died painlessly at 30. Jen biography number 2. Jen lived an extremely happy life. She never had children, but she lived a life that most people would find fulfilling. It's pretty much the same thing as Jen biography 1, except she died a painless death in a car accident at the age of 60. So the only difference between Jen biography 1, Jen biography 2, she lived double as long. She lived to be 60 years old. And then we get to Jen biography number 3. Jen has the same life as before, exactly the same. However, in this life, Jen lived an additional 5 years. And those additional 5 years of her life, it was pleasant, but not as good as before, but it was pleasant. She died a painless death in a car accident at the age of 65. All right, so we have the 3 different biographies. Make sense? So how many people want to live Jen life number 1? So remember, that's when she dies at 30, completely happy. Jen life number 1? No one? Oh, what, really? Okay, all right.
Let's get this over with.
All right. Jen biography number 2. Remember, this is the same life, but now she gets to live to be 60. So she gets double the amount of time. We got a couple people. Oh, yeah, okay, all right. It's a little surprising. Okay, so, and then we get to Jen life number 3. She gets the full 60 years, full pleasure, but then she gets an additional 5 years of, hey, it's pretty good, but it's not fantastic. How many people go to Jen? All right, thank you. Good, John. I'm glad to see that you're raising your hand back there. Okay, all right, so, yeah, 65. So, this is what Kahneman writes about the results of the experience. So, after reading a schematic biography of Jen, each participant, so he did this study with a bunch of students from the university, and then he followed it up with another study I'll talk about in a second. After reading a schematic biography of Jen, each participant answered 2 questions. Quote, taking her life as a whole, how desirable do you think Jen's life was? And quote, how much total happiness or unhappiness would you say that Jen experienced in her life? The results provided clear evidence of both duration neglect and peak end effect. In a between subjects experiment, different participants saw different forms. Doubling the duration of Jen's life had no effect whatsoever on the desirability of her life, or on judgments of the total happiness that Jen experienced. Clearly, her life was represented by a prototypical slice of time, not as a sequence of time slices. As a consequence, her total happiness was the happiness of a typical period in her lifetime, not the sum or integral of happiness over the duration of her life. As expected from this idea, Diner and his students also found a less is more effect, a strong indication that an average prototype has been substituted for a sum. Adding 5 slightly happy years to a very happy life caused a substantial drop in evaluations of the total happiness of that life. At my urging, they also collected data on the effect of the extra 5 years in a within subject experiment. Each participant made both judgments in immediate succession In spite of my long experience with judgment errors, I did not believe that reasonable people could say, I'm looking at you, reasonable people could say that adding 5 slightly happy years to a life would make it substantially worse. I was wrong. The intuition that the disappointing extra 5 years made the whole life worse was overwhelming. The pattern of judgment seemed so absurd that Diner and his students initially thought that it represented the folly of the young people who participated in their experiments. However, the pattern did not change when the parents and older friends of students answered. Okay, so this is pretty mind-blowing, right? That given a choice between, living 30 years, living 60 years, or living 65 years, that a lot of people would say there's no difference at all between living 30 and 60 years, and it's even worse to live 65 years. Because, from the point of view of the experiencing self, it's like, that doesn't make sense. That's bizarre and insane and crazy. What's up with that? But actually, there are a lot of situations in life where this comes up. I think I mentioned a couple weeks ago, my family went to Universal Studios. On Christmas vacation, we waited in the super long lines. That's a great situation where you can reflect on these rules, because you spend we went to Harry Potter World, you spend 2 hours in line waiting to go on a ride that lasts for about 30 seconds, maybe a little longer. And then, at the end of it, you say, wow, that was great. Which is, of course, completely insane, because you just blew 2 hours of your life, in misery waiting to get on the ride. But as long as the last couple seconds were enjoyable, people will do it. People will pay a lot of money to go to Harry Potter World. Some other examples of the peak-in rule and duration neglect. We seem to think that torturing is always bad, and it's much more humane to lock people up in prison for long periods of time. But just out of curiosity, how many of you would pick a day of torture over 10 years in jail? Wow, a lot of you. Okay, I'm surprised by that. Not everyone, though. Okay, interesting. The other place where it comes up is in judging long experiences. For example, a long vacation or work history or marriage. We often pity a person for a failed marriage, even if the marriage resulted in many years of happiness and only a single year of misery. We tend to focus really on the end result of something rather than the collective, the sum of all the happy moments in something. So that seems very strange. So, at this point, you should be asking yourself, which self is more important? The experiencing self or the remembering self in determining happiness? Because we've already seen that it feels like, the remembering self can make some pretty bad mistakes. So it feels like, people who fall prey to the peak-in rule and duration neglect are simply making a mistake. A happy life that is double as long, all things being equal, should be twice as happy. A colonoscopy that takes half as long and involves half the pain should be better. The fact that we make mistakes here would seem to indicate that we should just take extra care about making judgments about our past experience. Kahneman introduces and discusses a useful word. This word was coined by Daniel Gilbert. Is that how you say his last name? Daniel Gilbert and Timothy Wilson. The word is miswanting. So, making a mistake about what you should want. The idea is miswanting. And it means making bad choices that arise from errors of effective forecasting. So you might just interpret all these experiments that Kahneman has done as a big warning about miswanting things based off of your incorrect judgment of past experiences. But Kahneman doesn't really come to this conclusion. He says something a little different. He writes, a theory of well-being that ignores what people want cannot be sustained. On the other hand, a theory that ignores what actually happens in people's lives and focuses exclusively on what they think about their life is not tenable either. The remembering self and the experiencing self must both be considered because their interests do not always coincide. Philosophers could struggle with these questions for a long time. So, in other words, Kahneman argues that we can't completely ignore the remembering self. Only focusing on the experiencing self ignores an important part of what makes us happy. Okay, so imagine that I try to sell you on one of two vacations. We're going to have a choice here again. One of two vacations. There's a gold vacation. And the gold vacation, this is a deluxe vacation package. It's fantastic. You spend every day getting massages by grandmaster masseuse, whatever they are. But really good people at giving massages. You get the most delicious food ever, caviar mixed with 1964 Glenlivet Scotch. Really expensive stuff. However, there's a big catch to all of this. The big catch to all of this is at the end of this gold vacation, guess what? You have to take this pill, and the pill will make you forget all of it. So at the end of the vacation, you pop the pill, and you don't remember it anymore. All right, then we have the silver package. Silver package it's a little less enjoyable than the gold vacation. You get Kirkland brand Scotch, which they have at Costco, instead of the 1964 Glenlivet. However, the good thing about this one is you don't have to take the pill at the end, and you get to remember it. So my question is, how many people want the gold package?
Is there any documentation?
No documentation at all. That's cheating.
Does the pill erase the physiological effects of relaxation and
Good
pleasure?
answer. Oh, good question. Let's assume it does. So you have zero memory and zero effect on your future life. No, she's not going to do it. No one is going to take the gold vacation package. Come on, it has the expensive. You know how much the Glenlivet, that's expensive stuff there.
What's the difference in cost?
They're exactly the same. Okay. So how many people will take the silver vacation? Wow, that's unanimous. I didn't expect everyone to agree on that. Okay, so what this tells us is we really don't seem to care about things that happen to us that we don't remember, right? I mean, that's what's going on here. It has no effect on our future life. It's almost as if we're talking about a different person, a stranger, that all this stuff is happening to. It's not us at all. And just so you know that this isn't a purely hypothetical situation, there was actually a long article in the New York Times about this a couple weeks ago, because there's a certain type of drug that they give during surgery that has the direct effect of making people forget. And anesthesiologists can control pain in a surgery in one of two ways. They can either give you a drug that reduces the pain, or they can give you a drug that makes you forget all the pain. And often when the first drug doesn't work correctly, they'll fall back to giving the second drug. It's, the person experienced a lot of pain. Quick, give him this. He won't remember it, and he can't complain about it later on. I personally just find that terrifying, because I'm feeling sympathy for my previous, there's no way I can remember Stephen previous who went through that surgery. I mean, I feel bad for that guy who went through all that pain. But according to what you're saying, you really shouldn't care that much. It's a separate person, right? That it doesn't fit into the overall narrative of your life, what happened to that person who went through all that pain and forgot. So overall, this feels like evidence that we value our remembering self much more than our experiencing self. We can have bad experiences, but if we drop them from our memory, then we just don't care. That's what these things seem to demonstrate. One more distinction before we get to discussion. There's a second reason to be cautious about putting too much weight on our experiencing self over all other methods of judging our happiness. We often judge our happiness and other people's happiness not by their moment-to-moment level of pleasure and pain, but by evaluating the quality of their life. Here are two examples, right? These are my favorite examples. So who's been following Colin O'Brady's journey? Does everyone know who Colin O'Brady is? Oh man, Colin O'Brady is great. This happened last November. Colin O'Brady walked 921 miles across Antarctica over 54 days, all by himself, pulling a sled through 50 miles per hour winds at negative 40 degrees Celsius temperatures. He completed on Christmas. He woke up and he just decided, this was at the end of this 54-day trek, he decided he was going to finish the whole the journey in one nonstop 78-mile walk, going sleepless over 32 hours. I'm doing a single marathon, finishing this walk across Antarctica. So just imagine, he's out negative 40 degrees Celsius, 50 miles winds. He's by himself, carrying it. Started at 400 pounds, this sled that he was pulling, all by himself. No, the previous person who did this died, so he's probably not thinking happy thoughts. Just as miserable as you could get. And he did this of his own free will, and at the end of it, he seemed extremely happy about it. So that is definitely not an experiencing self moment, right? He's not making an evaluation about the happiness he derived from that experience by the moment-to-moment experience at all. Okay, another extreme example, similar example. How many people have read the Autobiography of Albert Schweitzer? So it's an amazing story. I think it happened, during the 1950s or so, but it's a while ago. He was a very religious person who decided at around the age of 30, which I guess at that time was considered quite old. I don't know why, but was considered old. And he decided that he was going to become a doctor, move to Africa, and cure sick people. And so the interesting thing about the biography is he goes through extreme suffering because he says, I was 30 at the time, all these other interns who were getting their medical degrees would go sleepless for hours. I was so old at 30, I struggled with it. And then he went off and he lived in the middle of Africa. He helped within the first 9 months over 2,000 patients who came and visited. But it was really harsh conditions because, really, really bad conditions. Again, not something that you would pick for a vacation. It feels, he's making that decision to do it not based off of future sort of forecasting of happiness. He's doing it based off of evaluation that this is something that's worthwhile to him. So the interesting thing in both cases is if both Colin or Albert's beliefs change, they would assess what they did in very different ways. So if you really want to before I talk about that, I want to call this type of happiness evaluative happiness, right? Because you're making a decision about the value of those experiences, not based on moment-to-moment experiencing, but based on your evaluation of the experience. And in both cases, you can change the amount of happiness by changing their beliefs. So in the case of Colin O'Brien, let's say that you got to meet with him on that last day of his journey. But you can bring along a little videotape and you show him this class of kindergarten students who did the same thing a couple weeks before. They're little kindergarten students, they're pulling the little sleigh, maybe they're wandering around, they're giggling, they're laughing, they're going across the same Antarctica. They do it in the same, period of time. I'm sure that would take away some of his, some of the happiness he got from, completing the experience. Because for him, part of the whole thing was it was a massive challenge that he overcame. If he discovered that a bunch of kindergartners could do it, probably wouldn't derive the same amount of pleasure from it. Or think of Albert Schweitzer. If you convinced Albert Schweitzer that by traveling to Africa, he was actually spreading new diseases among the Africans and was causing more suffering than helping people, then he would evaluate his life very differently. And that's, again, this is not an unrealistic example. A lot of things that we think are super meaningful when we're doing it, later on we might discover that they're not. That we had, all that time that you spent praying for people, perhaps in the past, before you become an atheist, and you say, well, wait a minute, that probably didn't help as much as I thought. Maybe I should have spent my time doing something a little different. You might actually evaluate those previous experiences a little differently. All right, so getting to the conclusion. The big conclusion here is don't trust yourself. You might be a very bad judge of what has made you happy in the past and what will make you happy in the future. Ensure that you're not falling victim to the peak end rule or duration neglect. Otherwise, you might end up paying for very expensive dinners which merely have good desserts. And finally, most importantly, consider that happiness might consist of much more than moment-to-moment experiences of pleasure and pain. Don't ignore how you evaluate your life when determining your level of happiness. That's it. Let's stop here. Let's discuss.